Today we look at St. Petersburg, what we consider a core Tartarian city, a federal city in Russia. St. Petersburg has an interesting official account in history. And as we know, if you have an interesting and very complicated account in history, it tends to be accepted because we enjoy our interesting stories. Looking at St. Petersburg, though, you'll find no shortage of extraordinary old-world buildings. And not just the major edifices that we'll be looking at in this exploration, but everywhere you look in this city. Let's begin our exploration of St. Petersburg and see what a true core city of Tartaria looks like. Why do we consider St. Petersburg a core city of Tartaria? Well, if we go off the theory that the surviving remnants of Tartaria, or the civilization that preceded ours, was centered around the Arctic Circle, then we realize that St. Petersburg is located not too far from the Arctic Circle. It's located basically along the line of latitude of 59 degrees north, the Arctic Circle being at 66 degrees north. Of course, they modify that based on the tilt of the Earth, blah, 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 blah. Make of it what you will. However, it's interesting that there are many cities, such as St. Petersburg, that seem to survive across what is today Russia, and a lot of the primary architecture has been preserved. When we look at the layout of St. Petersburg, we see the same design patterns that we've seen in other cities, especially in our recent explorations in the United States. St. Petersburg seems to bear a bit of a resemblance to New Orleans, at least in terms of how it was founded, yes, they use that word again, in the same time frame as New Orleans. And of course it has numerous star forts, or we'll just say geometrically beautiful locations. Naturally, the star fort here is simply an isolated military post that defends from sea and land attack. However, we always think that there's much more behind these star forts. St. Petersburg was founded in 1703 by Tsar Peter the Great, and this was one of the transformative events of Russia from a nation into an empire. When it defeated the Swedish Empire, yes, apparently Sweden had an empire too in the early 18th century, in what was called the Great Northern War. When we see these structures and we consider these accounts, there is much more to St. Petersburg than meets the eye. The official account tells us that after defeating the Swedes, that Peter the Great decided to found a city in 1703. And this is only 15 years before New Orleans, but it may as well be 1,500 years, because as we know in the 18th century, a lot could be accomplished well before the Industrial Revolution and even the advent of the railroad. We look at these older pictures of St. Petersburg and we see the very impressive architecture. And what's truly extraordinary about St. Petersburg is just how many examples of it there are everywhere you look. It's not just the major edifices. And even here we can see in this example of St. Isaac's Cathedral that we'll be looking at, these statues and all the infrastructure and detail that goes into it. There's really not that much difference when you consider some of the architectural stylings, but what makes St. Petersburg unique is the fact that there is just an extraordinary amount of this architecture that survives. And it's clear that what we're looking at is a former core city of the previous civilization that on this channel we refer to as Tartaria. Now there's a little bit of confusion because there's supposedly the remnants of Tartaria on many maps that's depicted, and that's more in what's now the Siberia region of Russia. However, I believe that what this likely is that for whatever reason there was a large surviving enclave of the previous civilization, and we see remnants of its architecture, and it just happened to be in this geographical area. Could be wrong, this is a theory, but I'm just explaining this is how this channel goes about explaining this theory, and why you have these extraordinary examples of this surviving architecture in Russia and in the St. Petersburg area. Looking at this column, and the General Staff Building, we see a very large compound. We see so many examples of beauty that are normally associated with the royalty in Europe, and the official explanation is that Peter and then the subsequent members of the Romanov family, that was the family that were the Tsars in Russia, they wanted to emulate the great achievements of Europe, and they wanted to build their own neoclassical architecture. And even though Moscow is viewed as the traditional capital city of Russia, and even Napoleon thought this when he occupied Russia, and the Tsar at the time was just hanging out up here in St. Petersburg and didn't have a care in the world that there was a large army in Russia. Well, I'm sure he cared, but we're supposed to believe that Napoleon brought an army of over 500,000 and lived off the land and managed to sustain it when they didn't have railroads at the time. But that's all right. It's a great story, and the more complicated and the more intricate the story is, it tends to be the accepted historical account. Looking at all these wondrous structures in all these older pictures, these are supposedly from the 19th century, some of them have some interesting discrepancies in them, we see the same things that we see when we look at the old pictures of the cities that we've explored in the United States. Unbelievable architecture with tremendous accomplishments, and yet an existing infrastructure that seems to indicate that there's some sort of power system in place. I mean, was there the telegraph? Was there electricity going on? A lot of these columns and these pillars and these walls look like they've been there much longer than since 1703. It's always intriguing when you consider the fact, though, that these cities were built on a very shortened timeline. We would expect the history of St. Petersburg to go back to thousands of years, such as many of the cities in Europe. And yet it started as merely a modest Swedish fortress in the early 18th century. The entire Russian Empire was built from winning the Great Northern War. And there's also interesting accounts from the Great Northern War of how the Swedish army was caught out during one of the worst winters in recorded history, and many died by simply freezing to death. That always seems to happen inconveniently. Peter was more determined, and even though the Russian army was not supposedly as proficient as the Swedish army, they managed to win several great victories. And yet, St. Petersburg was also known for its prominence during World War II, when the Wehrmacht attempted to capture it for over 3 years, and the city was in a state of siege. Many starved and died, and it was a very dramatic moment of World War II. However, for reasons unknown, the Wehrmacht, the German defense forces, which is what Wehrmacht literally translates to, interestingly enough, were unwilling or unable to commit the appropriate military resources to actually seize St. Petersburg, or Leningrad as it was called during the Soviet regime. Very tragic human story that no doubt occurred, and yet there's all these accounts of this destruction and what appears to be death on a very high human scale. And yet, despite that, many of the wondrous structures in St. Petersburg survive to this day. And we have images that document them from the 19th century to this day. So once again, it's a very unique and interesting account. And it almost seems as though that the more interesting and the more complicated the historical account that can be given to us is, we tend not to question it. Because people love a good story. And I suppose there's nothing wrong with loving a good story, but we have to remain objective, and we see that there's a lot more that may be involved in the true account of what's really happened in St. Petersburg that we have to consider. The structures across this city are not something that we can easily be explained. The official account will tell us that many of them were established by the Tsars, and they had forced labor, and that's how they managed to achieve these incredible things long before the Industrial Revolution and the advent of the railroad. Yet you will find that there is no shortage of buildings and structures across the city that would easily fill the wondrous art books of an account of a lost great world and a lost great wonder and glory that we can't easily explain. When I look at St. Petersburg, I see a city that exceeds anything that we've looked at in the United States and even the cities that I've seen in Europe. And remember that St. Petersburg was not the original capital city of Russia. It was Moscow. Yet, from the early 18th century, as part of their great victory over the Swedish Empire, this was the city that the Tsars built out of nothing in a very short amount of time to be their great capital city. And as is the affiliated concept with Russia, at least from the United States, Russia always loves to do things larger and greater. This is an interesting looking structure. It almost looks like one of the many arcades that we've seen, especially with the skylighting. We'll be looking into St. Petersburg more in future explorations. This is just merely an overview to give us an idea of what's there. And we start with the Church of the Savior on Spilled Blood, built from 1883 to 1907. And here we see a truly extraordinary structure with a lot of advanced architecture and advanced construction that goes into it. You'll also find, though, that there are similar patterns that we've seen in many of the structures that we've looked at in the United States and in some of the explorations we've done elsewhere. Similar patterns where there's this constant renovation, there's constant natural disaster, and you have to question, are we looking at the original structure, or has it been altered in ways and in time over the years? This is quite frankly a fairy tale palace, and that's the only way to describe this edifice with a name that's just so easy to say and say quickly at that. beautiful onion domes and towers, large adornments over every window, smaller columns that build up into a magnificent arch. All the capabilities of Imperial Russia in the late 19th century on full display here. And yet when you look at the surrounding buildings, you see nothing less impressive in the great architecture. This is definitely one of the types of buildings that tends to be associated with popular perception with Russia, and yet oftentimes people simply explain it away as saying they had forced labor and simply the will to do all these incredible things. Yet I think this is the finest example of how we see that there are similarities with the architecture in locations all across the land. You can see some of the coloring on some of the towers and the classic onion domes. And was this original coloring or was this added later? The interior is no less impressive. You'll find some of the most extensive and beautiful mosaics across the world within this structure, and even considering the floor and the giant pillars. Once again, this is something that defies simple explanation, and one of the statements about Saint Petersburg or Leningrad is that it is a city of many cathedrals, and there are certainly many cathedrals. And it's very intriguing when we consider the fact that the official account, at least in the United States, is that the Soviet Union didn't really care for religion, and in fact many of these cathedrals were supposedly repurposed as museums. And here, looking at the ornate beauty of some of these smaller columns that build up into what appears to be a great altar. These are many structures that I would love to visit in person and really get an idea for what's really being represented here in St. Petersburg. What I think this really shows us, though, is that this is a clear example of the remnants of a great civilization that preceded ours. And when you see this, and while this may be controversial to even suggest, it's very hard to deny that that's actually what's really going on here, unless we want to simply accept the official account that it was just forced labor. Well, much like in the United States, Russia also has its very convincing construction photos, and they do give us a very convincing construction photo of this great edifice. Because why not? Well, let's move on to Kazan Cathedral, built 1801 to 1811. So we start in the 19th century, and here we can already see we've got this wonderful dome and pediment and many, many, many columns. And this is yet another very well-documented building, and I'm extremely impressed that, once again, it only took them 10 years to construct this. And the explanation will be the same as any other edifice. It was forced labor, and, of course, the will of the Tsars would be imposed on the people. I always find it interesting, though, when you look at the historical account of how the Tsars and the Romanov family fell in Russia, and how it seems that people were willing to tolerate it when they were supposedly winning foreign wars, but then once World War I went against them, people had just had enough. Now, yes, I know the official history is a lot more complicated than that. And remember what we said about complicated history. When it's more interesting, people tend to accept it and they don't question it. You see on the dome here, though, many of the same styling cues that we've seen in many of the state capitals across the United States. You have the portal windows and the elaborate top. It is safe to say, though, that there is something that's even more decorative, though, about these edifices that we see in St. Petersburg. All these cathedrals, and yet any one of them seem like they could be repurposed as a museum, as some sort of large municipal building, or if you're in the United States, this would make a wondrous state capital, or even a federal capital. And yet all the architectural stylings look exactly the same in structures that we've seen across the land. And this is the prime detail that a lot of people will simply ignore. And they'll say that, well, Russia at that time just wanted to be like Europe, even though Europe was supposedly rediscovering this type of quote-unquote neoclassical architecture at the same time. And just everybody happened to be proficient. Architects were running around all over the place, and they had this skilled labor, even though we're told in many places this was forced labor that did this. Very interesting symbol there in the middle of that pediment. And yet all these columns are very well adorned. And how many columns are there in this building total? Again, this is something else I'd love to see on site and count. There are many pictures, though, that show different states of this building, and that wouldn't be too hard to explain, especially with the official account that St. Petersburg was under a state of siege for over 900 days during World War II. And yet, for whatever reason, the German military, and of course the nation of Finland, which was an Axis ally during World War II, was unwilling to continue the advance, and the German military was unwilling to reassign their 11th Army to seize St. Petersburg. Again, another conflicting account of hyper-military competence and incompetence, And there's also a statement about the statue of Peter the Great that precludes anyone from ever seizing St. Petersburg. Yes, here's this interesting symbol again. Not exactly a symbol we'd associate with the Tsars of Russia, but no matter. And the interior of this cathedral is no less impressive. As if you didn't see enough columns on the inside, well, we have even more beautiful and well-adorned columns on the inside. And we see the same styling in the ceiling that we've seen in cathedrals and churches across the United States. Very interesting. And of course, we have hundreds of years between the build times, and yet it's exactly alike. Of course, I would enjoy to see any of these supposed architects now try to design and someone try to build a building like this now. Someone will tell me in the comments that, yes, there is an architect that can do something like this. Perhaps there is, but I always find it at best to be a very perfunctory effort, and it does not match the quality of the construction materials and the quantity of these buildings that were being churned out all over the land according to the official historical account. But remember, it's very interesting and it's very complicated. So don't ask any questions, and as long as you don't ask any questions, you can accept the account as given. There's that symbol again. Well, we can explain it away. St. Isaac's Cathedral, built 1818 to 1858. Now, they do give a little bit more of a, I'm not going to say realistic timeline, but something that we'd expect with 30 years to put up this wondrous cathedral. And, of course, this is something that you can say resembles a wonderful capital within the United States. Look at the detail within the pediment, though. And I find that very intriguing. Now, apparently the architect did a model, and this is that model. And even on this little small model, the detail within the pediment doesn't come close to matching the actual real-life detail. Well, I guess it's true what they say. In Russia, if it's bigger, it's more complicated. We don't have a construction photo, but we have a very convincing construction drawing of this wondrous cathedral. And as you can see, it shows many of the same stylings that we see in the photo. Isn't that an interesting coincidence? Wondrous detail all across this cathedral, and again, statues with halos behind them all over. Again, as though they had all the ability to do all this kind of detail. Now, of course, we can explain this one maybe a little bit more proficiently because they do give a 30-year construction timeline. Once again, though, railroads were in their latent phase, and we have drawings like this, a two-dimensional drawing that supposedly shows exactly how the dome in this cathedral was constructed. And we've seen similar drawings with similar buildings across the land. I still can't get over just how ornate and detailed the interior of the pediment is. And then when you look at the columns leading up into the dome, there's something about this cathedral that even seems to exceed many of the state capitals that we've looked at in the United States. And I find it fascinating that the primary survival of a previous civilization would be so wonderfully depicted here in Russia, because in the United States we're often told that Russia serves many different purposes. At one point it's the great foil, at another point it's a worthy opponent. It just depends what time frame in the United States you're going off of. Looking at the interior, though, of this cathedral, you see many of the great columns and the beautiful pillars that are adorned in the exact same way of the columns and the pillars that we've seen in buildings across the land. And to say nothing about the gorgeous paintings on the inside of this incredible building. And once again, I wonder what the floor is actually constructed out of. It would be interesting to be able to go in person and really verify what the construction materials of this building actually is, or at least get an idea of what it really is. Is it a combination of marble, sandstone, granite? That's what we'll be told any structure in the United States or the other lands are. And I suspect it's the same story here for Russia, that we always say it's granite. Look at the dome, and you get that otherworldly impression looking up in the dome. And here we have even more beautiful figures that surround the dome, and the windows and the natural light. And I'm just completely impressed by how they were able to construct a building where they allowed natural light to come in and show such a series of incredible images, something we just don't seem to have the ability to do today, no matter how much glass we put in our great towers and skyscrapers. And of course, it's explained that this is a religious building, and we'll also be told it was repurposed as a museum. Well, let's go to the General Staff Building, 1819 to 1829. Officially, this was built to commemorate Russia's victory over Napoleon, and this is quite an extensive compound, and it's actually part of a much larger compound, and here you're looking on the inside of it. Very impressive for early 19th century. And the wondrous achievements of the Tsar and their architects at that time. Of course, the official explanation is that they had an infinite amount of forced labor. And wait until we look at the Winter Palace and consider that account. Another great column and something that even rivals such places as the Vatican. And of course, it matches the official explanation that they simply wanted to match the glory and the grandeur of Europe. Well, why? I mean, to me, it seems like they're vastly exceeding it, but, make of it what you will. Wonderful columns and arches, and yet, oddly enough, these statues on the top don't seem to be something that necessarily reflect what we'd associate with traditional Russian culture. It seems to be more of that, I don't want to say Rome, but oddly enough, we have the same figures that we see in the United States in strange places such as Des Moines in the Iowa state capitol. And yes, I go back to that because those figures remind me of that. The sheer size of this compound, again with the columns that are integrated into the wall, and then of course all these very pretty base stones that you see. And again, looking closely at the statue with our horses and chariots and what appear to be our Roman Greco-adorned figures. I guess, everybody wanted to be neoclassical. This is a view of the compound, and on the top you can see the General Staff Building, and then on the bottom you see the Winter Palace, again built by the Tsars, and we'll look at that in a moment. This is just to give you an idea of how many buildings look like this and how many are located in this immediate vicinity. And just consider the sheer size of the Winter Palace and then the General Staff Building. So the General Staff Building was supposed to be constructed for military purposes and to commemorate the victory over Napoleon. And then the Winter Palace was supposed to be the main palace of the Tsars. All in the same compound, but then you see not just the main buildings, but also all the surrounding buildings have this incredible architectural styling to them. I mean, honestly, we could spend days, weeks, and months doing videos about St. Petersburg. And now we go to the Winter Palace, built 1730s to 1837. It was the fourth palace on this site. It supposedly has 1,500 rooms, and given the size of it, I see no reason to doubt that. Here's a view of it from the water. And yes, calling this a palace is very appropriate, not just with the decoration, but just the sheer number of columns that are integrated in the wall, and yet you see the same architectural stylings that we see in many other buildings. This is a very extensive structure, and it is very appropriate to call this a palace. But many of you might be asking, well, how exactly does this compare to other palaces? Well, let's compare it to Buckingham Palace, and here you can see Buckingham Palace superimposed on the Winter Palace. Once again, it matches the classic stereotype that in Russia they do everything bigger. Well, it's not just a little bigger in this particular case. We're told that the Winter Palace, though, had a fire in 1837, and that it was rebuilt by thousands of workers, and many died daily. And they were simply replaced. I guess it was just that easy to find skilled labor at that time. There's many depictions, though, that show just how complicated and ornate not just the decorations of the Winter Palace is, but the actual layout of it is, and the functions behind it. Now, the interior of the Winter Palace is interesting to consider because it's hard to find photographs that show it directly, but there are a lot of paintings and a lot of demonstrations that show that there is a beauty and a complexity to the interior of the Winter Palace that just exceeds anything that we've seen in many of the other edifices that we've looked at in our explorations over the time. And this is something I find truly extraordinary about the account of St. Petersburg, because if these are real depictions, and there are pictures that do give a little bit of reinforcement that these are real depictions, then this is really a surviving building from a previous civilization that exceeds our wildest dreams. Because as if there weren't enough columns on the exterior of this building, the columns on the inside of this building seem to go way beyond the concept of simple forced labor. And when you look at all the decorations and the fact that it seems as though there was no limitation, you look at the historical account that, yes, it took them 100 years to build this building. It built in a fire. And here's an actual photo, for example. Then they had to use forced labor to rebuild the building. And it just seems as though they had whatever they needed whenever they needed. You didn't need a railroad. You didn't need any heavy machinery. This was all pulled off at a time when such things were not even available. And it should be noted that this isn't the only very largest in the world structure or object that's located in St. Petersburg. Just astounding views, though, from the exterior. And you can see that every single window is adorned, numerous columns on both floors, and here we have an interior picture where once again we see the columns that are integrated in the wall and the beauty on the ceiling. And just, opulence that exceeds the ability of words to describe. And of course, the story of the Tsars and how ruthless they were, and how unfortunate it was that many people suffered for hundreds of years accepting this rule, but then once things got bad enough, they were finally able to revolt. Looking at the interior, though, I believe this is called the small throne room. Again, you see more of this wondrous detail, and again, more beautiful designs within the floor. Supposedly, this structure was repurposed, or at least a portion of it, repurposed as a hospital during World War I. Interesting to see hospital beds underneath those chandeliers with all those columns around there. Well, let's look at the Bronze Horseman, the commemoration of Peter the Great, built 1768 to 1782. The thunderstone that it rests on is 1,500 metric tons, cut down to 1,200. This is supposedly the largest stone ever moved by human beings, the thunderstone that this statue of Peter the Great rests on. Yes, apparently they cut it out from the rock. The name Thunderstone comes from the crack of lightning and thunder that supposedly preceded it, and then they moved it over the snow and ice to put it in its present position to build this statue of Peter on top of Tsar Peter after he had achieved his great victory over the Swedish Empire and founded the city of Saint Petersburg in 1703. Just considering the fact, though, that this official historical account tells us that they moved this thunderstone and that it's the largest object moved by human beings, although we can certainly debate that because we've seen other large stones across the land, it's still impressive, though, to consider that this was achieved and done. And you should consider the fact that much smaller stones that weigh far less, being moved even a couple miles by modern machinery and modern transportation is very difficult. Well, they also have the Zar Bell, cast 1733 to 1735, largest bell in the world, weighing 445,000 pounds, or 201,000 kilograms. Yes, a bell that was never hung, but for some reason was cast, because I guess they just need to have the largest things in the world in Russia. And of course, that's what we'll be told when we don't actually live in Russia to explain these things. The Peter and Paul Cathedral, built 1712 to 1733, oldest landmark in St. Petersburg. And I think this is a rather astounding landmark as well, because early 18th century, again, no heavy machinery, just forced labor, and we'll be told that's how this incredible edifice was constructed. I don't know. When you look and you see how this tower just reaches to the sky. Now, this is supposedly the burial plot of the Tsars, and this was the cathedral that they were buried in, and this being a very prominent landmark in St. Petersburg. It should also be noted, though, that looking at it more objectively, we see that there's a very peculiar structure that this particular edifice is within. And these are the structures that we've seen all over the place that we'll colloquially refer to as star forts or star structures. So not only do you have this amazing edifice with this very unique tower in the middle of it, but it's also in the middle of a very peculiar structure that I really wonder what exactly it's made out of. And look, as if it's not enough, they even throw a little pediment with some columns over there on an entryway to it. So if this was all achieved, according to the official historical account, then it just isn't something that is very acceptable given what we're given with the limited amount of time frames, the limited capabilities at the time. You have to accept whatever you're told just because it's a complicated and interesting story. And I don't believe that in the case of St. Petersburg, it stands up to scrutiny. It seems very clear that there was a wondrous civilization, and this isn't even one of its greatest achievements. We believe that the greatest cities and the greatest edifices are no longer standing. What they left standing was what they could explain away by saying that forced labor by a very tyrannical regime is what achieved it. Yet we can find examples all over the land where we don't have that same explanation. There is beauty, and there is something that really speaks to the interior spirit of human beings in all these edifices. And you can see that within this wonderful cathedral, it's the same thing on the interior. So what do you think? Do you believe the official historical account is correct for St. Petersburg? Or do you think that this really does show the evidence of a pre-existing civilization? Well, we're going to be looking at it a little bit more closely. Join the channel on live stream where we're going to consider resets, coming up on October 7th. Well, thank you for joining me for the exploration. I hope you enjoyed it. Please like, comment, and subscribe.